Hello and welcome. In this guide, I'll be doing a deep dive into placement configuration. In the scene, I have a simple model that will serve as our weapon rack. I also have 3 items that I want to socket onto the weapon rack. To get started, I'm going to create some settings. Go to Tools, Hypertonic, Ultimate Socket System. And this is the settings menu. So if you haven't already got some settings, you can create some new settings by hitting the Create New Settings button. For now, I will save them into a settings folder. And I will do the same for the item tags. Perfect. Now we can define a tag for each of the items we want to place into the socket. Cool. Now we have our tags defined, we can create a posing prefab for each item. Posing prefabs should only be a visual item. We don't want any behavior added to them, so we don't want any colliders, rigid bodies, or custom scripts. So most of the items that you have will probably already have those items attached. So there's a utility tool which will generate a visual representation of that prefab. And what that does, it will basically create a copy of the item, strip off all the components apart from the mesh renderer and the mesh filter, so you have a nice visual of the item. Let's use this utility tool to create 3 posing prefabs for each of the items. Cool, so now we have those items created and assigned, we're ready to pose the items in the socket. Before we do that, let's take a quick look at these posing objects. So yes, as you can see, it's just a mesh renderer and a mesh filter. Perfect. Okay, so now we're ready to turn the weapon rack game object into a socket. Right click on the weapon rack, go to Hypertonic, Ultimate Sockets, Add Socket. So what this has done is added a placeable item socket game object nested below the original item. And over here in the inspector, you can see the custom editor for the socket displaying all of the functionality we need. For now, we're going to let any item be socketed, so we're going to hit the Any Tag Allowed button. Then if we move over to item placements, this is where we will configure all of the functionality related to the item placements. The first section is called Placement Transition Settings. This allows you to define how an item moves into a socket when it's been released. By default, the item will snap into the position you defined. However, you can get it to tween there by enabling this checkbox. Once enabled, you can define how long that tween lasts for, and you can give it an animation curve. Next up is Profile Type. This lets you choose between saving the item placements locally to the object or saving them to a config file where they can be shared across multiple sockets. For the purpose of this guide, we'll select Scriptable Object. And I'll show you how you can share these settings across multiple sockets. The default placement config is applied to any items that are socketed which you haven't configured a placement for. Most of the time, if you're using the default placement config, you won't want the scale to change, in which case you need to tick this checkbox here to keep the default scale of the item. Otherwise it might change to 1, and that could have undesired effects on your item. The next section is Item Placement Configs. This section shows when the profile type is set to Scriptable Object. You can assign an existing profile if you already have one set up. If you don't, you can press the button to create a new one. Now we've created our placement profile, we can start configuring the item placements. Next up is the Configure Item Placement section. This is where you configure each item's specific placement within the socket. To get started, click the Configure Item Placement button. Once you've clicked that, select the item you want to configure. Let's start with the shield. I'll start by moving it down into position and then rotating it. For more fine-grained control, you can change the values in this area over here. When you're happy with your placement, hit the Save Configuration button. Let's repeat the process for the other items. Notice this tick box here. If you had lots of items in the list, you could reduce the list to only the ones you haven't yet configured by clicking this checkbox. Let's do the sword next. Now we've done the sword, let's do the second sword. Because this item is so similar to the previous one, we can use the Clone Item Config button. This allows us to clone an existing config. This is pretty much a perfect clone, so we're going to leave it as it is. Hit save. That pretty much covers all of the item placement section. The only thing left to show is using these shared configs on another socket. So let's do that now. I'm going to duplicate this weapon rack and I'll delete the socket. So if this was a totally different item, we could do the same thing. We could make this into a socket. We're going to Hypertonic, Ultimate Sockets, Add Socket. We will also allow any item to be placed. Go back to Item Placements, go to Scriptable Object, and then from here we can choose the existing config we've made. There we go. Now we can access the same configs on two different sockets, and we can edit them in either place. That's a good point. So to edit an existing config, you can configure an item that's already been configured and it will load it into the position that you last saved. You can then modify it how you like and save that again. It's as simple as that. That pretty much wraps up this video on item placements. If you have any questions, please email the support email or drop a message in the Discord. Thank you for watching.